Welcome to the Probate Nation. My name is Richard Ruddy. Whether you are helping mom or dad with their estate planning or doing your own planning, or you are a court-appointed guardian for an elderly adult, planning for a funeral and burial is something that should not be overlooked or pushed aside to a later date because the topic is uncomfortable. In the course of 2 shows, we are taking a look at the decisions to be made and information needed to arrange for the funeral and burial of your loved one, or for the aging adult you are caring for as a guardian, or frankly for yourself. We began that conversation in part 1 with the initial decisions to be made and information that is needed as you work with a local funeral home to begin the process of organizing that funeral and burial. And thank you to Kathy Yunkin, funeral director at Fairfax Memorial Funeral Home, for leading us through that initial discussion. Tonight, in part 2, we continue with a look at the various considerations and decisions to be made to complete arrangements for a funeral and burial. We are pleased to have another local funeral homeowner and director with us to continue this conversation. Our guest tonight was born, raised, and educated in Virginia. Following his graduation from Mary Washington College, he has worked in the funeral industry for over 29 years. He is presently the owner and operator of 2 local funeral homes, Cunningham Church Funeral Home in Alexandria and Montcastle Church Funeral Home and Crematory in Woodbridge. Please welcome Michael Church, owner and funeral director at Montcastle and Church Funeral Home. Michael, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for coming over and sharing all of your expertise.
Yes, sir.
So we're going to go through the process. Again, we start that whole process of someone's died. And so the initial thing that comes to mind for me is that they're in the midst of a very emotional time. So what are some of the common mistakes folks make as they begin to deal with that grief and they come in to see you?
Common mistakes are, number 1, they just sort of rush to decision making. They don't sort of stop, talk to family members, relatives, talk to the funeral home. And number 2 is, or they allow somebody else to step in and start handling those arrangements for them.
So what advice would you have for folks in order to sort of mitigate those issues? So as they begin that process, what advice would you have for them as they start this process then?
As they begin the process, I would talk to family members and reach out to the funeral home. We're there to help the families and to guide them through the process, so it's important to get the funeral home involved as quickly as possible.
Sure, of course. And I guess if people have written anything down, we certainly want to make sure we capture that information that may help them as they come in to visit with you as well. So let's talk about, what are the decisions that folks need to make, the funeral decisions that they need to make at the outset?
So ultimately, we start with the method of disposition and work backwards. Are we going to be buried or are we going to be cremated? Will there be a viewing, a funeral ceremony, mass? Those types of decisions are made first.
Okay. And of course, one of the decisions, I guess, is so who makes those decisions? Let's just go to start there.
Typically, if there's a surviving spouse, it's the surviving spouse.
Okay.
If there are children, then it's important that the children get together. For example, if there's 3 children or 5 children, they get together. And typically what happens is they kind of come up with the spokesperson on their own. Hey, this is such and such. She's going to handle the arrangements.
Okay. Now, of course, once we make those arrangements, somebody has to pay for that. Who's going to pay for that?
Traditionally, it's a surviving spouse,
okay.
Or else oftentimes it's a spokesperson, or again, the family decides who's going to be the spokesperson, and typically that person is asked to sign our contract as well.
Okay. Now, what happens if the families can't agree? There's disagreement, there's not a consensus. What do you do?
We wait. Our position is we take no position at all. So really, we will stop the arrangements until the family can come to a mutual decision. And that doesn't delay it very long, typically maybe a day at most.
Okay. Now, we talked a little bit, but can somebody actually, before they pass away, complete a form to designate someone to be the decision maker?
They can,
okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to add, I know we're going to show on the screen, it's called a Designee agreement for carrying out funeral arrangements. Mm-hmm. And this is where somebody could actually indicate, I designate child A or this person to make these decisions, so on and so forth. And then that person accepts that that appointment, okay, gets notarized, and then this document then gets produced for the funeral home, I guess, and then they know who's in charge in case the family can't agree. It doesn't mean the family can't still be part of the decision-making process, but if we have a dispute, at least we have somebody who's in charge.
Absolutely.
It helps move the process along. Let's talk about the initial funeral home visit. So someone has died, and they come in they pick a funeral home. Okay, so what are the things they need to decide during that initial meeting or get done during that initial meeting?
Well, one of the first things we're going to do is take some information for a death certificate.
Okay.
We need to fulfill a couple of legal obligations. One of them is filing a death certificate. Then we'll talk about types of services. Will there be a visitation or viewing, gathering, funeral mass, memorial service? What types of services are we going to have?
Okay.
As well as followed by the disposition. Again, cremation or burial.
So again, as we talked about, as you mentioned at the outset, you work backwards, okay?
We do, yes.
Where are you going to be buried, how are we going to dispose of you, and then we'll work backwards as far as how we fill in all the different spots.
Correct.
Okay. So I guess when they first come in too, I suppose we're also looking to see whether or not there's any financing arrangements been made. They have prepaid funeral and stuff like that.
Correct.
So what are some of the key documents they need to bring with them when they first come in to see you?
One of the most important documents they can bring to me is their Social Security card.
And you want to see the actual card?
We do. That number gets transposed a lot. People are grieving, they're full of emotions, so we want that number because it is a nightmare if just 2 or 3 digits gets transposed.
And I will tell you, I shared in the earlier program with Kathy that I actually had a situation where the last 2 digits of that social were transposed in the death certificate, and it totally confounded the IRS when the CPA was doing the taxes because he looked at that and used that to do some of his filings. I mean, it was a mess. Okay, so yeah, you want to make sure that social. I can see why you want the Social Security card.
Yes.
Sure. And of course, if they're military, you'd like to see the DD.
We will need the DD 214.
Because that'll help with burial arrangements and all that stuff if you're going to go to the military burial. Now, I know we talked about the outset. There is actually a form that a lot of places have, and I'm sure you have one as well that people can complete. That would fill in all that information for you in advance of coming to see you.
Correct, yes. Okay. And the way online is these days, most funeral homes will have that on their website. You can submit it to the funeral home so they have the information prior to your coming in the door.
Okay. And I have emphasized that we suggest when we're doing our clients are doing their estate planning work, this is a good time to go ahead and take a crack at that.
Correct.
So that way people don't have to figure out who was someone's maiden name before mom was married. All right, let's talk about, a lot of the stuff that we start to do now, if we're going to talk about the burial and funeral, is religious considerations. So I want to kind of get your, it seems like those are very, very important. Are they?
Yes.
Okay, so how do they come into play? Tell us some of the things where they come into play in this whole decision-making process.
The burial and funeral considerations, they come into play based on, a lot of it's dictated by religious beliefs, what their background is. If they're Jewish, if they're Buddhist, for example, Jewish people are not cremated. Buddhist people typically are not buried.
Interesting.
Yes. So if you are Jewish, you have to know the laws and the customs. Typically, burial is within anywhere from 24 to 72 hours. If you're Buddhist, then what you'll have is the monks come to the funeral home for the chants, and they actually witness the cremation process or the start of the cremation process.
Okay. So that's so we need to know about that from the very get-go.
You do, yes.
And so if you're planning, you want to make sure people know you want this that you are of a particular religion.
Correct.
So very, very important. Let's talk about the funeral service. Okay, so what types of funeral services are available to folks?
Well, people can have just about any type of funeral service they want, and it needs to be individualized. It needs to reflect the life of the deceased. So funerals can be a mass at a church. It can be something something at the graveside, something at a memorial service. Maybe cremation takes place, so they have a memorial service. We've gotten very creative, and we've had blues and barbecue parties in our parking lot, and then people have ridden to the cemetery in their Harleys. So if you can think of it, something that makes it very unique to that individual is something very special. Something I tell my team is no one's going to remember the box in 10 years from now, but if you create a meaningful ceremony, people will always remember that.
And I thought that was very interesting. When we were preparing for this show, you mentioned that. And I found that to be very, very, a very good guide for folks. Okay, because I think a lot of people just think it's just an exercise, and in fact, it can be something that can be a big event, especially for larger families too.
Yes.
So, so what type of services are typically available at a funeral home?
Well, we can have a visitation or wake.
Okay.
We can use our chapel for the funeral ceremony itself.
Okay.
And then any type of gathering, some funeral homes will have a reception hall, things of that nature can all take place at the funeral home.
Okay. So if we're just doing a viewing, for instance, at the funeral home, what type of services would typically be available at a local church or mosque or wherever the service may be?
So the church is going to have guidelines. For example, the Catholic Church, we don't open the casket in a Catholic church for Mass.
Okay.
So if there's going to be a viewing, that needs to be done at the funeral home. If there's going to be a church service, we need to check with that church to see what their rules and regulations are. But yes, we can have Mass, funeral ceremonies, celebration of life, memorial services. Those are all done at local places of worship.
Okay. And what are the most what are the most restrictive religions as far as services? Is there anyone in particular that really has the most restrictions as far as what you can do?
I wouldn't call them restrictions, but they all have their own set of guidelines that we have to work within.
Okay. Okay. So what type of services are typically available at a cemetery?
Cemetery is typically just the burial. We
Okay.
may gather for a final prayer, which is, we call it a committal service. It's a final prayer for a service we've already had.
Okay.
If you're in the military, that's where your honors will take place, at the cemetery.
Now, for the military, now if you're going to be buried in a military cemetery, is there a long wait time to get in there to do that?
That depends on the cemetery.
Okay.
For Arlington National Cemetery, yes, you can wait 4 or 5 months. For Quantico National Cemetery, some of the other national cemeteries, the wait isn't as bad, usually a week.
Okay. So we're going to come back and talk about burial a little bit later. So, who typically presides over the services that are being done? Either at the funeral home,
The
at
clergy.
the church, so whoever the clergy is for that particular religion.
Correct. And we always try to ask the family, if they're a member of a church or a particular religious denomination, who their clergy is, who would they like for us to contact?
Okay. And if they don't have someone in particular, then you can generally will have somebody that you
can.
can call upon. Now, we talked a little bit about etiquette. Okay, so one of the etiquette questions is, of course, do we need to pay some? I mean, obviously, we make arrangements to pay the funeral home to do all the things that they do, but we have clergy coming in. Do we need to compensate them?
Yes.
Okay, so there's usually some fee amount that's usually fairly customary, and folks can rely upon you folks to kind of give them some guidance about that?
Correct. And typically, we tell families, think of it like a wedding. They don't have set prices. Anywhere from $250 to $500 would be acceptable.
Okay, okay. Then, of course, if you have altar service or you have organists, it's all the additional fees that would be
Correct.
address each one of them because they're providing a service. Now, we started to talk about burial, so let's turn to that now. Let's go back. I know you mentioned this. Why are burial decisions important before even discussing funeral arrangements? And I know you answered, but I want to make sure I don't miss this.
So burial decisions, why we start and work backwards is because we need to make sure the cemetery can accommodate us. For example, in the case of national cemeteries, we go based on their set time schedule. In private cemeteries, they may have an event already scheduled at that time and they can't accommodate us.
Sure.
And that's one of the pitfalls why we tell families, come speak to the funeral home first, because we're there to quarterback all of this. We orchestrate, we contact the cemetery, the clergy, we make sure all the pieces, everything falls into place.
I think it's very, very important. You really are the quarterback to some extent. So the decedent is going to be buried in a casket. What arrangements need to be made at the cemetery to make this happen? They're going to be buried in a casket, or they're going to be buried in an urn and placed in
So the cemetery might have an individual requirement, and a decision to be made at a cemetery is going to be if it's casket or urn, is that ground burial or is that above ground burial? Whether it's a mausoleum for a casket or a niche for an urn. The cemeteries may also require some sort of outer burial container, and that's what the casket would go into when it's in the ground.
Okay. Now, again, we talked about for a veteran to be buried at Arlington Cemetery or Quantico, which is in our neck of the woods, and where my father-in-law actually is buried. What is the process there? Okay, so do we have to do they contact Arlington, or do you contact Arlington? How does that work?
So the first thing we need before we can contact Arlington is that DD-214. Whether it's for the veteran or the spouse, we need the DD-214. One of the main reasons why you call the funeral home first. We'll notify the cemetery, send them the discharge paperwork so they can be verified, and then from there we handle all of the arrangements.
So the thing from a planning standpoint is that all those veterans out there who are doing their estate work need to make sure they get a copy of that DD-214
Yes,
so
sir.
people can actually have it.
Yes, sir.
And especially if the veteran dies first, we're now looking for that because we want to get the wife buried there.
Absolutely, that's
Okay, so that
correct.
can be a key impediment. So again, from a planning standpoint, that's very important to collect that information now.
Yes.
When they know where it's buried, someplace in a folder, someplace down in that filing cabinet.
Correct.
For a decedent who's going to be cremated, what are the burial options?
Well, we get asked this question all the time. What to do with the ashes? They can be scattered. They can be kept at the house. They can be buried in a cemetery. You really have more options with cremation than you do, burial. Burial is just burial in a cemetery. What cemetery? Cremation, you certainly have far more options.
Now, I know we talked about this when we were getting prepared for this show, and I've had actually clients who have directed that they wanted their ashes scattered at this place or that place. And I know you expressed some words of caution about that. You want to share that with us?
Sure. The one drawback that I've heard from families that have scattered their loved one is they want to go and be with them on their birthday, on their wedding anniversary, on their date of death anniversary. Going to the valley or to the mountains isn't the same as having a physical place to go be with that person.
Sure, that makes sense. So when we're doing what types of decisions does a family need to make regarding the actual burial itself? Is there anything specific they need to do there?
Really, what cemetery?
The cemetery is the key thing?
In a time frame.
And who would be there, I suppose,
Correct.
if they want to have different people. Let's talk for a couple of minutes about, we talk about arranging things in advance. There is an ability to pre-arrange and prepay for your funeral.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so how do folks pre-arrange their funeral? Do they come in? They come in and talk to you,
Yes.
come sit down with you,
Yes.
or basically at that time you're going through all the questions you would ask their kids if the kids came in.
Correct.
And so now they get to help collect all that information.
Correct. And
based upon their decisions.
Correct. And information we don't have, such as that DD-214, we tell them, we're going to need this. This is piece number one. You need to find it or request a copy of it.
So now you're reminding them to do something that's going to end up being required anyway, so they
Yes.
get to work on that. Now, when they come in to see you, do they take anything away with them so they can actually give it to their kids?
Sure. We do have guides to planning ahead, which help the process, but we will also give them an itemized statement so they know what the financial responsibility is going to be.
But all their decisions as far as whether they want to
Yes.
have a viewing and all that also is captured in some sort of a document they can take with them to give to their kids.
It is, yes, sir.
And that's very, very important. I can't stress that enough. So that really takes a lot of burden off them. So they've made people can come in and make arrangements as far as what I want to have happen. Can they also make arrangements to pay for it?
They can.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about how they do that.
So you can pre-fund a funeral as well.
Okay.
And you can either make monthly deposits or payments, or you can pay for it all up front. And that eliminates the burden from their children or spouse from having to make that financial commitment later.
Okay.
One of the advantages to that is it'll also help control the cost.
So, and I think I learned that when I was doing my mother-in-law's funeral, making her arrangements in advance, that I guess we freeze some of the cost so that if she died 5 years later, I'm paying the
Correct.
cost based on 5
You've already
years?
paid for it, so unless the arrangements have changed in some fashion, you won't have to pay anything.
And that can be helpful, because I guess prices
Extremely
are
helpful.
going up.
Yes.
It become more and more expensive to get to be buried these days, it seems
Yes.
like. Well, let's talk about some common issues that you see. What are some of the common mistakes families make in arranging a funeral and a burial?
The number one common mistake I see is they set something up with the church or their place of worship before they talk to the funeral home. So the funeral home might not be available, the cemetery might not be available. They sort of rush to start planning this prior to speaking to anyone at the funeral home.
Okay, so that's a big issue.
It is.
Okay. And so that, I guess, leads us back to the beginning, which is, probably one of the best things that they can do at the very outset is to identify the funeral home they're going to work with and go talk to them.
Correct.
Okay, so that you can then begin that process, as you just discussed, of working backwards. Where are we going to end up, and then how do we get there?
Correct.
So that process can be daunting. What are some of the steps that they can take to eliminate or at least minimize some of these common mistakes?
Some of the steps to eliminate is really talk ahead of time. You don't have to come make pre-arrangements, but talk to your family members. Let them know this is what I would like to have happen. At least then they have a framework to sort of work within. I can't tell you the number of people that have sat in my office and they've literally put their hands in their face and they don't know what to do because they've never discussed it. So sure, this is what funeral homes do. We'll give them options and we'll lead them down the right path. But the number one thing families can do is just talk about it.
It's very interesting that you should say that and emphasize that. I know Kathy did the same thing. Is that, you can have a viewing with an open or a closed casket. And a lot of folks don't want to open casket, okay? Because I've had people tell me, there's no way that I look any good at that point, no matter how good the funeral home is.
Sure.
So, but you wouldn't know that unless you asked that question.
Correct.
Okay, so I think that's the really most important thing I think you've just hit on is having the uncomfortable conversation with mom or dad or your spouse or with that person, that elderly person who you're taking care of, which might be an uncle or an aunt or maybe someone you're appointed as a guardian by the court. Okay, so they may still be able to give you some guidance about what their wishes are, or talk to their family and find out what their wishes were. So that can be captured. And do a lot of people pre-fund their funerals?
A good number do.
Okay.
And really, it makes economic sense too. Go ahead and pay for something you're going to use. The price is going to increase. I think statistically speaking, funerals double every, 10 to 15 years, I believe. So why would you not lock that cost in now?
And you said you can pay monthly. I didn't understand. I did not know that.
Yes. So there are a couple of formulas that go into this, but a lot of it depends upon age. You can make monthly deposits or payments, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years.
Okay, that's very interesting. That's helpful. Well, we're running towards the end of our time period, but I wanted to ask you for some final comments. If you can share some final words of thoughts or advice to folks as far as practical suggestions about making funeral and burial decisions.
When you have the conversation with your family about what you want to have happen to your parents or what you want for yourself, part of it is listen to them and have an interactive conversation. Because while someone might say, don't go through any trouble for me, I don't want to be viewed, I don't want a ceremony, put me in a cardboard box and forget about me. Well, that's fine, but we have services for the living. So part of that is understanding, hey, Dad, you know what? A lot of my friends, I'm going to be mourning. A lot of my friends would like to come out and show their support, and that's helpful in my grieving process.
Sure.
So I'm going to need this. Is it okay? I'd still like to, I hear what you're saying. You don't want anything at all, but I'm going to need something for closure. Can we have a viewing? Can I at least have a funeral ceremony for you? Can I remember your life?
Right. That's true. I have heard those conversations. Just bury me in a cardboard box, I don't care. But it doesn't really work quite like that.
Correct.
So, listen, I want to tell you, Michael, this whole topic is very difficult and emotional for many people to discuss, and and especially if the planning is going to be done during a time of grief. So I the professionalism and compassion that you and other funeral directors show to folks during their times of grief is really, I'm sure, a great source of comfort to them as they sort these things out. So God bless you for all you do, and thank you for all your service to the community.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having me on today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for
you.
coming. You know, we hope you found the information in both parts 1 and 2 on funeral and burial decisions helpful. Please have a conversation with your family and gather now the information that will be needed so they can make good decisions regarding your funeral and burial arrangements consistent with your wishes. One of the best ways to accomplish this objective and lighten their burden is to sit down with a funeral director of your choice. Let them help you make these decisions and others now while you are alive and can make the decisions for yourself. And of course, please share your plans with the family. All this work is a great gift to your family for which they will be eternally grateful. This brings us to the conclusion of our series on funeral and burial decisions. Replays of this series of shows and all the shows broadcast to date, along with other helpful information, can be viewed on the Probate Nation website. On behalf of myself and the entire Probate Nation, thank you for visiting with us.